There's a secret residence permit in Europe that gives you rights across 25 EU countries, but almost nobody applies for it. Instead, they choose the option that locks them into one country only, such as Portugal. Today, I'm going to tell you exactly why this happens and explain which strategy makes sense for you in 2026. When you search online for permanent residency in Portugal, you'll find tons of information about Portuguese permanent residency. But there's another option that most lawyers don't even mention, and that's called EU Long-Term Residency. It's governed by EU law, it's recognised across most of Europe, and it gives you conditional mobility to relocate to other EU countries. But it's like a secret that nobody really talks about. So in this video, I'm going to break down the real differences between EU long-term residency, Portuguese permanent residency, and EU citizenship. I'll show you which one gives you the most strategic value, which one is easiest to get and why. And this is coming from someone who lost EU citizenship because of Brexit. The path you choose depends entirely on Portugal's upcoming citizenship timeline changes, so we'll factor that in as well. All right, so let me set the stage. You've been living in Portugal for 5 years, let's say. You've had your temporary residence permit all that time. You've learned Portuguese, you've passed the citizenship exam at A2 level, and you're pretty settled here. And you're thinking about applying for permanent residency. This is where it gets interesting because most people assume that there's only one sort of permanent residency option. That's Portuguese PR. That's what all the Facebook groups talk about, and that's what shows up in Google searches. But legally, you actually have these two choices. Option one is Portuguese permanent residency. That's a standard domestic permit that gives you indefinite stay in Portugal, only Portugal. And option two is this EU long-term residency permit, which is an EU-wide status, and it's recognized in 25 out of the total of 27 EU member states. That gives you the rights to a permanent stay in Portugal, but it also gives you conditional rights to relocate across the EU. The requirements are almost identical to Portuguese PR. It's 5 years of legal temporary residence, A2 level Portuguese, a clean criminal record, and proof of income. So the differences are very small, but the strategic value is quite different. Now, before I go any further, let me clarify something important. EU long-term residency is recognised in 25 of the 27 EU countries, but there are two that opted out, and that's Ireland and Denmark. And crucially, this status doesn't extend to the European Economic Area countries, which is Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and it doesn't include Switzerland either. So this is an EU directive and it's not an EEA-wide agreement. So that makes it different from EU citizenship, which covers all 31 of those countries. So I'm going to now break down exactly what each status gives you, as well as caveats about what it doesn't. Let's start by talking about Portuguese PR, because that's what most people apply for. So Portuguese permanent residency gives you the indefinite right to live in Portugal. So you don't need to apply for a new temporary permit each year or every 2 years, but you do need to renew your residence card every 5 years, and you have to comply with the absence and conduct rules. Secondly, it gives you full access to work in Portugal. So that's any employer, any job, being self-employed, or whatever you want. Thirdly, it gives you access to Portugal's national health system, the SNS, just like citizens. Or it gives you social security rights, including unemployment benefits, pensions, maternity leave, based on your contributions. And it gives you access to public schools and universities for your kids, often at EU tuition rates rather than international rates. And finally, it gives you access to family reunification, so you can bring your spouse, your kids, or your dependent parents. So Portuguese permanent residency is a pretty solid status to have. You get equal treatment in almost every area, except for voting and certain public sector jobs. But there are a few things that Portuguese PR doesn't give you. And the most important one of these is no EU mobility. This permanent residency permit is only valid in Portugal. So if you ever wanted to move to Spain, France, or Germany, for example, you would have to apply for a residency visa there and start from scratch. So yeah, you're starting over basically. Secondly, there are much stricter absence rules. So if you leave Portugal for more than 24 consecutive months, or more than 3 months in any 3-year period, you lose your permanent residency status. Also, you don't have political rights. So you can vote in regional and local elections, but you can do that as a temporary resident as well. So even as a permanent resident, you can't vote in national elections, and you also cannot vote in the EU Parliament. And you can't run for office. You can't pass permanent residency to your children. Your kids don't automatically get it just because you have it. So Portuguese PR is fine if you're 100% committed to Portugal and you have no intention of ever relocating within the EU, and if you're not that concerned about having the right to vote in the country where you're spending your life. But there's another important consideration that we need to talk about, and this one is a big one. Okay, now let's talk about this secret option that almost nobody chooses, which is called EU Long-Term Residency. So, what is it exactly? Well, it's governed by an EU directive, and it's recognised in 25 EU countries at the moment. So, that's everywhere except for Ireland and Denmark. And it doesn't apply to Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, or because those are EEA countries and not EU member states. So it's slightly more restricted compared to EU citizenship. So what do you get with this residency permit? Well, you get conditional mobility, which is not the same as freedom of movement. So I want to repeat this again because EU long-term residency does not give you the right to freedom of movement anywhere across the EU. People get confused about this. But you don't get unrestricted freedom of movement, but you do get this conditional mobility. So what that means in practice is that you can relocate to another EU member state, but you still need to apply for residency there and meet certain conditions. So let's take a look at how that might work in practice. Let's say you've got EU long-term residency, which you got in Portugal after living in Portugal for 5 years. But then you get a job offer in Berlin. So you don't need a visa to enter Germany. You can just move there. Then you can apply for residency after arrival. And in this case, Germany has to process your application under facilitated rules. So they can't just treat you like a random third country national who's starting from scratch. You get this preferential treatment because you already hold EU long-term residency status. But, and this is important, you still need to meet certain conditions, and these can be quite rigorous compared to what EU citizens go through. So it's usually proof of employment or self-employment or sufficient income. And yeah, it's easier than applying for a standard German residency visa. It's not automatic like freedom of movement is. You're still going to get immigration authorities evaluating your application, and they can reject you. And if you don't meet the criteria, then it's likely that they will reject you. And your family can follow you under the same facilitated rules. And after spending 5 years in Germany, you might want to apply for EU long-term residency status there too. So in a nutshell, it's better than Portuguese PR in terms of mobility. It's still not the same as freedom of movement, which only comes with citizenship. You're still dealing with immigration applications, income requirements, and bureaucracy. Basically, you're still asking them if you can become a resident rather than exercising your rights under the Maastricht Treaty to become a resident anywhere in the zone. So what's the catch here? Why isn't everyone applying for this EU long-term residency? Well, apart from the fact that a lot of people just don't know about it, there's another difference here, and that is that EU long-term residency has a no social assistance rule. So to get it, you cannot have relied on social welfare at any point during your 5 years in Portugal. But in contrast, Portuguese permanent residency does not have the same rule. If you've used social assistance like job seekers, you can still get Portuguese PR, but EU long-term residency would typically be off the table. Other than that, the requirements are pretty much identical. You need 5 years of legal temporary residence. You need A2 Portuguese language proficiency. This is specific to Portugal. So in general, under the directive of the EU, the long-term residency status doesn't stipulate that you have to pass a language exam. But Portugal specifically requires it for both EU long-term residency and Portuguese PR. You also need proof of a stable income, you need health insurance, a clean criminal record, and proof of adequate accommodation. So if you meet these criteria and you haven't used welfare in the last 5 years, then you will be eligible to apply for EU long-term residency. When does EU long-term residency actually make sense over Portuguese permanent residency? And the answer for you is when you've decided that you don't want to pursue Portuguese citizenship, when you want the option to relocate to another EU country, and you're willing to give up your path to Portuguese citizenship to do it, because that is the trade-off, really. It's crucial. If you move to another EU country using your EU long-term residency status, you are going to lose your continuous residency time in Portugal. Those years that you spend in Germany or Spain or wherever do not count towards eventual Portuguese citizenship. Portuguese citizenship requires continuous residence in Portugal. If you leave for another EU country, the clock will reset. So EU long-term residency is an either-or choice. Either you stay in Portugal and you pursue citizenship, or you use your EU long-term residency to move elsewhere and give up the Portuguese citizenship path. So let me tell you something from personal experience. I used to be an EU citizen. I had freedom of movement across 31 countries, all the EU member states, plus Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, and the UK actually. So it was 32 at that time. With this, I had the rights to live in Portugal, work in Germany, retire in Spain or Greece, and nobody could tell me otherwise. This was my right under the treaty. But then when Brexit happened, all of that was lost. So when I talk about EU citizenship, I'm not being theoretical. I know exactly what it feels like to have it, to exercise those rights, to lose them, and then fight to get them back. When you naturalize in Portugal and you become a Portuguese citizen, you also become an EU citizen. Let's take a look at exactly what that gives you. The most important thing is unrestricted freedom of movement across 31 countries. It's not conditional, it's not facilitated, it is unrestricted. You don't have to apply for a visa. You don't have to show income requirements in most cases. And you don't have to be approved at immigration. You basically just move. You show up after 90 days at the government office, register your address, show your passport, and you're done. It also gives you full political rights. So if you have a Portuguese passport and citizenship, you can vote in national elections. You can also run for office, and you can vote for the European Parliament. So you're not a guest anymore. You are a citizen of that country and you have all the rights as anyone who was born there natively. Also, you have maximum security of all these statuses. So citizenship is almost impossible to lose. Okay, there may be a handful of cases where it can be revoked for serious crimes in some cases, but you can live abroad for decades and you'll never lose it. You no longer get stuck with absence rules, no renewals of the status, only the passport, and there's no bureaucracy to deal with. Finally, you get consular protection from anywhere in the world. So if you're traveling to a country where there's no Portuguese embassy, you can walk into any EU embassy from any other country in the EU and you can ask for help just as if it were the Portuguese embassy. Right now, as I'm filming this, there are some major changes afoot, and I cover them in this video here. Portuguese citizenship currently requires 5 years of legal residence in Portugal, which is the same timeline as permanent residency. So you could theoretically just skip permanent residency altogether and go straight for citizenship after 5 years, which is what I'm doing at the moment because it's very difficult to get an appointment with IMA. That's always been my recommendation, really, because why stop at residency permits when the timeline is the same and you can get the real thing? But this change could shake things up a lot. So it's still a proposal at the moment, and it's working its way through the Portuguese Parliament. The government has proposed to extend the citizenship timeline from 5 years to 10 years. Keep in mind that at the time of recording this video, which is November 18th, 2025, this is not law yet. It hasn't been approved or signed, and it could still be amended or rejected. But if it does pass, then it's going to fundamentally change the strategic calculation at play here. Portuguese citizenship moves to a 10-year timeline, then permanent residency stops being just a stepping stone or an optional nice to have, and it becomes an essential part of your long-term strategy. All right, so now you understand these three options. Let's make this practical. So if the citizenship timeline stays at 5 years in Portugal, which is probably unlikely given the current political climate, but in the event that it does, my recommendation is simple. Just skip permanent residency altogether. You can just keep renewing your temporary residence permit. And when you get to the 5-year mark, just apply directly for citizenship. There's no strategic reason to get permanent residency if you can get citizenship at the exact same timeline. Citizenship gives you everything that permanent residency does, plus this all-important freedom of movement across 31 countries, political rights, and multi-generational inheritance. Why would you settle for less? If Portugal extends the timeline to 10 years, this is for people who are not from the Portuguese-speaking community. For them, it's 7 years. If the proposed 10-year timeline does become law, then you have a decision to make. If you're committed to Portuguese citizenship, then at year 5, I recommend applying for Portuguese permanent residency because it's slightly easier to qualify for than the EU Long-Term Residency. And since you're staying in Portugal for the full 10 years anyway, you're not going to use the EU mobility rights because you'll have to start from scratch. Stay in Portugal, keep building your life there, keep enjoying life, contributing to the country, and keep your residence continuous. At year 10, you can submit an application for Portuguese citizenship. If you don't want to go after citizenship, then at year 5, I recommend applying for EU long-term residency because this gives you this conditional mobility to relocate to 25 other member states if your circumstances change or if opportunities arrive. So basically, you're trading the Portuguese citizenship path for additional flexibility. And if you settle somewhere else for 5 years, you can apply for EU long-term residency status in that country too, if you want to. I think the key here is really being honest with yourself about your goals. Do you want Portuguese citizenship? Then stay in Portugal and don't use this EU mobility rights. But if you want the flexibility to move around Europe, then look at EU LTR and accept that you're giving up the citizenship path. So my personal take is that because I know exactly what unrestricted freedom of movement is worth, I know what it's like to have it, lose it, and to fight to get it back. And I think if you have the opportunity to gain this through naturalization, then that is a very worthy goal that will transform your life. No matter whether it takes 5 years or 10 years, citizenship of any EU country is the only status that gives you real, permanent, and unconditional freedom across 31 countries. I don't recommend settling for residency permits if you have a chance to go for the real thing. So to wrap up, you currently have 3 options after 5 years in Portugal. Portuguese Permanent Residency, which is Portugal only with no EU mobility. EU Long-Term Residency, the secret permit, which gives Portugal plus conditional mobility to 25 EU states. And Portuguese citizenship, unrestricted freedom of movement across 31 countries, full political rights, multi-generational and permanent. I lost my EU citizenship through Brexit. I know how much it's worth. If you can get it through naturalization, that should be your goal. Everything else is just a stepping stone or an alternative path. Don't settle for less. If you found this helpful, please hit like and subscribe to the channel. Comment and let me know your path and whether you think the 10-year timeline will pass. And if you want to subscribe to the Digital Emigre newsletter for up-to-the-minute updates on changes in citizenship policy across Europe, you can find the link in the description. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.